There are 10 habits that silently destroy your relationships in old age, and most people don't even realize they're doing them. I didn't understand the weight of that sentence when I first heard something like it. I thought it was just another exaggeration, something people say to sound wise. I had already lived most of my life believing that relationships fade naturally, like seasons changing. People get busy, children grow, friends move away. That's how I explained it to myself. But I was wrong. I only started noticing the truth later in life, when the silence became too consistent to ignore. Calls that used to last an hour became 10 minutes. Visits that used to feel warm became polite and short. And the strangest part was that no one ever told me why. There were no arguments, no explanations, just distance growing slowly, quietly, until it felt normal. At first, I blamed time. Then I blamed others. But I never looked at myself, not until much later. The first habit didn't look dangerous at all. In fact, I used to think it was a form of honesty. It was constant negativity disguised as truth. I remember sitting on a wooden bench outside a small grocery store with an old colleague. He was talking about something simple. I don't even remember what exactly. Maybe a new hobby or a trip he wanted to take. Something light, something hopeful. And I interrupted him. Not because I was angry, but because I thought I was being realistic. I started pointing out problems he hadn't even considered. Risks, failures, things that could go wrong. I thought I was protecting him from disappointment. But I saw his expression change slowly. The excitement faded from his voice. He nodded, but he didn't really respond anymore. The conversation ended sooner than it should have. A few weeks later, he stopped calling, and I told myself he was just busy. I didn't realize that people don't always leave loudly. Sometimes they just stop returning to spaces where they feel drained. The second habit was even more subtle, turning every conversation into health complaints. At first, it felt normal. Everyone my age talks about their body, their pain, their sleep. It becomes part of life. But slowly, without noticing, it became the only thing I talked about. I remember one afternoon when my daughter came to visit me. She brought small pastries from a bakery she liked and sat across from me at the kitchen table. She tried to tell me about her work, something she was clearly excited about. Her eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen in a while. But I kept steering the conversation back to my discomfort, my back, my blood pressure, the medications I was trying. At some point, she stopped trying to continue her story. She just listened. And I remember thinking she was being patient. Now I understand she was slowly leaving the conversation without standing up. She stayed shorter after that, visited less, and I convinced myself she had less time. The third habit was the hardest to admit because it didn't feel wrong at the time. Correcting people instead of listening. I thought I was sharing wisdom. After all, I had lived longer, seen more, made more mistakes. I believed that meant my perspective mattered more. I remember my son once telling me about a problem at work. He didn't ask for advice. He just needed to talk. I could see it in his face. He was tired, maybe even frustrated. But I interrupted him before he could finish. I started telling him what he should have done differently, what I would have done instead, how he could fix it next time. He went quiet, not angry, not defensive, just quiet. And that silence felt heavier than any argument. After that, he stopped sharing those small moments with me. Not because he had nothing to say, but because I had stopped being someone who listened. I didn't see it then. I only saw it later, when conversations became shorter and more careful, as if every word had to be measured before being spoken. And that was the moment I realized I had already started pushing my own family away without even noticing it. After that realization, something in me changed, but not immediately. At first, I tried to deny it in small ways, like we all do, when the truth feels too uncomfortable to hold. I told myself people change, families get busy, life becomes quieter with age. It felt easier to believe that than to look at my own reflection honestly. But then I started remembering moments differently, not as isolated events, but as patterns. The fourth habit was something I once thought was kindness, giving unsolicited advice. I remember my daughter once talking about a decision she was struggling with. She was hesitant, unsure, speaking slowly as if she was thinking out loud more than asking for help. And I interrupted her, again. I gave her solutions she never asked for, clear steps, explanations, warnings. I thought I was being useful, even protective. But she stopped me halfway through and said she just needed to talk it out. And I didn't understand what that meant at the time. Now I do. Because after that moment, she started sharing less. Not completely stopping, just filtering. Like she was careful about which parts of her life were safe to bring to me. And I ask myself now, when did I stop being someone she could think out loud with? The fifth habit was quieter, almost invisible at first, living too much in the past. I used to believe memories were something to share, something that connected generations. But I didn't notice when they became a wall instead of a bridge. I remember sitting with my grandson, trying to explain how things used to be when I was his age. I talked longer than I realized, about roads, schools, how people communicated, how life felt slower. He nodded politely, but I could see his attention drifting somewhere else. Not out of disrespect, but out of distance. Because I wasn't meeting him where he was. I was pulling him into a world he didn't live in. And I started wondering, when I talk about the past, am I sharing it or am I escaping the present? The sixth habit hurt to notice because it came from something I thought was harmless. Subtle disrespect toward younger people. I remember a moment with my son where he explained something about his work, something modern, something I didn't fully understand. Instead of listening, I dismissed it too quickly. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough for him to feel it. A slight tone, a slight smile that said I knew better. And he didn't argue. He just stopped explaining things to me. That silence was not anger. It was distance forming in real time. And I ask myself now, when did I start believing that understanding only comes with age? The seventh habit was the most dangerous because it looked like strength. Emotional withdrawal, acting like nothing matters anymore. There was a period where I stopped reacting to things the way I used to. Good news didn't excite me as much. Conversations felt lighter only when I stayed silent. I began saying things like, "It doesn't matter," more often than I realized. I remember sitting at a family dinner, everyone talking, laughing, sharing stories. And I was there, but not really there. I responded less, smiled less, engaged less. I told myself I was just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was disappearing emotionally from the space I was still physically in. And slowly, people adjusted to that version of me. They stopped pulling me into conversations as often. They stopped expecting reactions. And I didn't even notice when I became more of a presence than a participant. But the hardest truth was still ahead of me. The habits I didn't even recognize as destructive until it was almost too late. By the time I reached that realization, it didn't feel like one single moment anymore. It felt like looking back at a long road and finally noticing how many small turns I had ignored along the way. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just quiet choices that slowly shaped the distance between me and the people I cared about. The eighth habit was something I never considered harmful. Gossip disguised as concern. I remember sitting with an old neighbor on a bench outside our building. We were talking about people we both knew, as neighbors often do. At first it felt harmless, just updates, small observations, shared curiosity. But then I noticed the tone shift in myself. I wasn't just sharing anymore. I was analyzing other people's lives, their problems, their mistakes, their decisions. I told myself it was concern, but it wasn't. It was judgment wrapped in conversation. And over time, I noticed something strange. People still talked to me, but less freely, as if they were careful about what they shared, like something might be repeated elsewhere. That's when I understood. Trust doesn't break loudly. It fades quietly when people no longer feel safe in your words. The ninth habit was even harder to see because it looked like pride, refusing help and isolating yourself. I remember one winter day when my son offered to fix something simple at my home. It wasn't anything important. He just wanted to help. But I refused. I insisted I could handle it myself. I said it too quickly, too firmly. He didn't argue. He just nodded and left it alone. And I remember standing there afterward, thinking I had done the right thing, thinking independence meant strength. But days later, I realized something else. That moment wasn't about the task. It was about connection, about allowing someone to be part of your life in a small, practical way. And I had closed that door without even noticing. How many times had I done that before? How many small moments of connection had I turned away because I thought I was protecting my pride? The 10th habit was the quietest and somehow the most painful. Losing curiosity about other people's lives. I remember sitting across from my daughter during one of her visits. She started talking about something new in her life, something she was clearly excited about. She waited for me to ask questions, to engage, to follow her story. But I didn't. Not because I didn't care, but because somewhere along the way, I had stopped being curious. I thought I already understood enough. I thought I had already seen most things life could offer. And she noticed. Her voice became shorter, her details less vivid. And eventually, she stopped sharing those kinds of stories altogether. That was the moment it hit me hardest. Not the distance itself, but the silence where curiosity used to be. And I started asking myself questions I avoided for too long. When did I stop wanting to know more about the people I love? When did I start believing I already had enough understanding of their world? In the end, it wasn't one habit that changed everything. It was all of them together, quietly building a version of me I never intended to become. But here is what I finally understood, standing in that silence of reflection. I was never a bad person. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold at my core. I was just unaware. And awareness, even when it comes late, still has value. It doesn't erase the past, but it changes how you carry it. I don't see my life as something broken anymore. I see it as something that needed to be understood differently. There is a strange kind of peace in that acceptance, not because everything is fixed, but because I finally stopped pretending I didn't play a part in it. Now, when I speak, I try to listen more than I explain. When someone shares their world with me, I try not to step out of it too quickly. And when silence appears between me and someone I love, I no longer assume it belongs to them alone. It belongs to both of us. And maybe that is all we ever really get. Not perfection, not certainty, but the chance to notice, to adjust, and to be a little more present than we were before.